Hi guys, so today we are going to be talking about independent versus dependent variables in scientific experimentation. So these are two things that are going to follow us all throughout the year and in fact all throughout any time that you do science. So we're going to start by looking at an example. So, lots of vocabulary, some of the words sound the same. It's going to seem like it can get very confusing, but I promise you that it isn't. For that reason, before I start explaining anything to you, I want us to just think about this example. So, if we think about a person who has bought some wonderful, beautiful plants to have in their house or in their apartment, and is trying to grow them. Okay, she starts to realize that some of her plants are growing nice and tall, their leaves are getting big, they're supple, they look beautiful, whereas some of her other plants are not doing so well. They're starting to wilt, maybe some of them are dying, maybe she had to throw some of them out because they completely died. So this really is what science is. This is a very simple example, but this is what science is. So we see things that are happening, and as scientists, our job is to try to find an explanation for why. So I want to think about simple example, these plants in this apartment. Why are some of the plants doing better while others are doing more poorly? Okay, so that's what science is looking at relationships. So something that happens that causes an effect on something else. So a lot of times, just like in our plant example, they can get more complicated, but it's much the same. Scientists are always asking questions like that. How does something affect something else? How does blank affect blank? If I change blank, what will happen to blank? So if I change one thing, what will happen to another? So this is really all that we're going to be doing in science, and understanding this is going to allow you to really undertake any sort of scientific investigation and be successful in it. So in science, we're constantly asking questions like this, looking at how one thing affects another. So what do we call these things? We call them variables. So variables, the big word, you hear it in math, but all it means is something that can be changed or manipulated and that I can then measure it within my scientific experimentation. So anything that's able to be changed and measured is what we just call a variable, okay? Now, in any experiment, so again, think back to my plants. This is an experiment. We're going to see, right? Experiments don't have to be complicated. In any experiment, there are two types of variables that exist. There are the independent and the dependent variable. And today, we're just going to look at what those two mean. So my independent variable is the variable which in that experiment I change intentionally. So we can use the word manipulate. Manipulate just means to change something on purpose. So this is the variable that I think probably is going to have an effect on the other variable. For that reason, I am going to purposefully change it in order to see what that causes. So again, let's think back to my plant example. So she wants to answer what's going on with her plants. Why are some plants thriving while others are dying or doing very poorly? So what are some of independent variables that she could purposefully change to try to find their effect on those plants? It could be something as simple as changing the amount of water. She gives some plants more water, gives some plants less, and then gives some plants no water at all. She could also manipulate the amount of sunshine that she gives her plants. So she puts some plants right in front of the window. She puts some plants a little further back from the window, and then maybe she puts some in the basement where they don't get any sun at all. So these are things, independent variables, things that we manipulate purposefully in order to find their effect. Okay, another example here that I mentioned, she could use a different brand of plant food. Maybe for some of her plants she uses Miracle Grow. For some others she uses the generic kind that she got from the dollar store, and trying to see what effect that they have on those plants. That leads us right to my other variable. So my dependent variable is the one that I'm going to look at in the end. This is the one that I'm going to measure in order to determine if the changes I made to that independent variable have any effect. So you should say this out loud, pause the video and say this with me. This is the variable that is dependent upon the independent variable. That is why it is called dependent. So this depends on what changes you make to the independent variable. So if I change my independent, my dependent, because it is dependent, is probably going to experience a change as well. And what we want to do is we want to measure it to see what exactly that change was. Okay, now in this case, hopefully it's very obvious at this point. If we change the amount of sun or the amount of water or the amount of plant food that we give to the plants, The dependent variable, or the thing that we're going to measure to determine the change that occurred, is the growth of the plants. Okay, so it could be height, it could be, how healthy they are, but how well those plants are growing would be the dependent variable in this situation. So we can see here in this example, changing the amount of sunlight, changing the amount of water, changing the type of plant food. Independent, I do it on purpose. Dependent, how well those plants grow, okay, is going to be affected by the changes that I made to my independent variable.